welcome to Stowe Talks, a podcast designed to support people going through a relationship breakdown and all the challenges this brings. I'm Matthew Taylor.
And I'm Lisa Gatchell, family lawyers at Stowe Family Law, and today we're looking at parental responsibility. What is it, how do you get it, and can you lose it? So parental responsibility then is one of these terms that I think people assume that it's one thing and perhaps it isn't. So we often talk, we often get clients come in and they will make assumptions that perhaps they can dictate what the other party's doing during, the children's time with that party, or that it perhaps goes further than it does. So do you want to start us off with what parental responsibility is?
Parental responsibility is the sort of legal term that covers all the rights and responsibilities that go with bringing up a child, really. So it covers the duties, the powers, the rights that parents have in relation to their children. And it includes things like making decisions about your child's care and upbringing, so where they live and who they spend time with, where they go to school. Decisions about their health, about whether to get treatment for certain things or not, religious decisions, which religion they're going to practice, and then just generally anything relating to the welfare. So it's a concept that kind of encompasses everything that is to be a parent. What you talked about, sometimes there's a sort of, maybe a view that gives you the authority to make decisions without necessarily considering other people, but obviously in most cases, and not all, and we'll come on to this, but in most cases, there are two parents with parental responsibility. So, Lisa, how does that work when, these sort of, rights of parental responsibility come into conflict?
I think parental responsibility is a legal concept that actually day to day in most parenting circumstances, if you like, is not something that you're going to need to refer back to. It is those big decisions, what secondary school should the children be going to? Should they move areas? If there's a very important medical decision that needs to be made, those decisions then need to be made together. What it isn't is having to agree necessarily what time the children go to bed or who they are seeing day to day, or what they're eating for their dinner, or what their daily routine is. Those are all decisions that each parent will make whilst the children are in their care, and can do so without kind of the approval or agreement, if you like, necessarily by the other parent. So parental responsibility is very much about these big decisions being made jointly by both parents who have the parental responsibility. But it's not very often that these kind of big issues will come up, and most of the time people are able to agree what secondary school, for example, the children are going to attend. But there are circumstances where they can't agree. And if they can't agree, we then have to look at, what happens in those circumstances.
Okay. So, let's maybe strip it back to, this sounds like a really obvious question, because you're going to say, well, it's a parent, isn't it? But who has parental responsibility for a child?
Yes. Who has parental responsibility? It's not as easy as just saying mum and dad have
Of course it isn't, because
because
the law.
This is the law.
Yeah, of course.
It's not as easy. And I suppose let's just say for now, as for the purposes of this podcast, we're very much going to be talking about heterosexual parents. Parental responsibility and legal parentage has to some extent some slightly different rules when we're looking at same-sex parents, and I think to go down that rabbit hole today will perhaps get a little bit complicated. So we're going to strip it back, and we're going to be looking at heterosexual parents today, and it may be that we revisit same-sex parents in perhaps one of our Modern Family podcasts, which we'll be doing in the future. So who has parental responsibility? The first thing is that the mum, so the woman that gives birth to the child, will have parental responsibility, and that's automatic. The question of whether the father has parental responsibility really does depend on the circumstances at and around birth. So if the father was married to the mum, then he will have automatic parental responsibility and then be named on the birth certificate. It gets slightly more complicated if the parties weren't married at the time. So if they're not married at the time, then usually the unmarried father would be looking at acquiring parental responsibility either through being named on the birth certificate. So that's kind of the usual one, let's say, where the unmarried father will get parental responsibility. Alternatively, they could enter into a parental responsibility agreement with the mother. It may be that they subsequently marry the mother, and that would also provide them with parental responsibility. If those things can't be agreed, so for example, let's say it can't be agreed that they're going to be named on the birth certificate, or the mum has registered the birth without them, they're not married or planning to get married, mum won't agree to enter into a parental responsibility agreement because perhaps they've separated post-birth and there is some acrimony there. Then in those circumstances, we're then kind of looking at court-appointed parental responsibility. So you can apply to court for a parental responsibility order in its own right. But also if you get certain other orders in relation to the children, they can also confer parental responsibility. So for example, if you apply for a child arrangements order to state how the children is going to split, who the children are going to live with, let's say, and you get a lives with order, then that will give you, if you're named in that order, that will give you parental responsibility. And sometimes if you apply for a spends time with order, so kind of the old contact orders, then the court may well make a parental responsibility order alongside that as well.
So what about other parties? I mean, is this wider? Is it just strictly limited in heterosexual couples to the mum and the dad? Who else could potentially be granted parental responsibility?
Yeah, it's definitely not just limited to the parents, because there are plenty of circumstances in modern life where you might need somebody else to be able to make these kind of important decisions. So, for example, when we're talking about child arrangements orders, perhaps it's that the children live with an aunt or an uncle or a grandparent, and the order is stating that children live with that person, and therefore that person will be granted parental responsibility from that order. So yeah, it's about looking at who is the person that needs to be making these important decisions, and making sure that you've got the right order in place to allow that. We also have looking at grandparents in particular, it's not uncommon sometimes for special guardianship orders to be made where perhaps the parents aren't capable of looking after the children, but they are still involved to a certain extent, and a special guardianship order will mean that the parental responsibility is shared between all the parties, but the party that's named in the special guardianship order kind of has parental responsibility that sort of trumps the other parties. So that's quite an important order in some circumstances, because it allows them to know that they can exercise their parental responsibility if they need to, without necessarily the agreement of all of the other parties with parental responsibility. There's no actual limit to the number of people that can have parental responsibility. I mean, I would say ordinarily you're probably looking at anywhere from sort of 2 to 4 people if that parental responsibility is shared with, as I say, grandparents or aunts and uncles, etc., who may be caring for the children. But there is no specific limit to the number of people.
Yeah, and you end up with this sort of hierarchy, don't you, of parental responsibility, where standard normal parental responsibility, mum and dad, the aunts, the day-to-day carers, the grandparents, whoever it may be, all need to act together and also need to agree to the exercise of parental responsibility. No one's takes precedence as another's. It's not the case that, well, your mum and you've always got parental responsibility, unless something we'll come on to in a minute happens, but that doesn't take precedence over anyone else's. Even if someone's been granted parental responsibility at a later stage, a grandparent hasn't had parental responsibility from birth, an unmarried father not on the birth certificate hasn't had parental responsibility from birth in the way that a mum would, that parental responsibility is still of equal status. And then you get this next hierarchy, don't you? The special guardianship orders, where you have the sort of trump card and what you say goes. Now, those are court-made. They're often quite contentious. They can be done by consent if a mum and dad accept that they're not in a position to care for their children and their parents are doing so for sometimes a short period of time, because then these special guardianship orders can be discharged, at which point the special guardian would lose their parental responsibility. So maybe we should talk a little bit about in the circumstances in which parental responsibility can be lost then.
So the big one is adoption. So if an adoption order is made, then the court effectively legally reassigns legal parentage and parental responsibility to the adopted parents. And as a result, anybody that had original, if you like, legal parentage or parental responsibility will lose it. And that, I guess, is where sometimes the special guardianship orders come in as a midway point, because it tends to be in circumstances where perhaps we would be looking at adoption orders because local authorities are involved, and there is a concern that the parents haven't been able to care appropriately or provide an appropriate level of care for the children. But perhaps to go as far as an adoption order is one step too far, because then we're really playing with the family dynamics, because all of a sudden grandmother's becoming mum legally and all of that type of stuff. So that's where the sort of special guardianship and just providing that bit of a trump card with the parental responsibility comes into play. But when we're looking at losing parental responsibility, it's really quite rare that a party would lose parental responsibility. But adoption, I think, would be the most common way in which somebody loses parental responsibility. Other than adoption, it's important to say that if the parties were married at the time of birth, then you can't, other than with adoption, you can't lose your parental responsibility. But when we're looking at unmarried fathers in particular, who may have acquired parental responsibility post-birth through the ways in which we've discussed previously, parental responsibility can be removed via a court order. But I would say it's quite rare for that to happen. And when we look at the case law, it's very stark that these cases have quite upsetting facts, let's say. So circumstances where perhaps there was a case where the father had committed GBH and admitted to it against the child, and therefore in those circumstances the court felt that actually, yes, this is a case where the parental responsibility should be removed. And there was another case where the father had sexually assaulted the siblings of the child, and again this was felt to be significant enough that parental responsibility should be removed. But it's, I would say that it's incredibly rare for parental responsibility to be removed. And if the courts are erring on that, ordinarily they might just simply limit the parental responsibility, perhaps via a prohibited steps order, just again maybe almost to try and work around it and provide that trump card, if you like, to the other parties with parental responsibility, without actually removing it from that parent.
Yeah, I think it creates some difficulties, doesn't it? And especially there are situations, I'm sure you've had clients like this, Lisa, where you've been instructed by a mum who wants to make certain decisions about the child, and dad just hasn't been on the scene for years and years and years, and but then may object to something, especially if you come on. We've talked before on these podcasts about relocation applications and wanting to change and move to another country, and they can be objected to if a person with PR doesn't consent to that move. And if the dad was married to the mum at the time of birth, then PR can't be stripped. Obviously, a mum can never lose the PR unless there's an adoption. So it can become difficult, but it's a very high bar. Sometimes, we do get clients who kind of want to explore that option because the relationship has broken down and things. But really, it's got to be something that is really very extreme. There's been some extreme welfare concerns. The child has, usually had a pretty horrible experience at the hands of the person with PR. I mean, that would also apply to any kind of non-biological parent who has PR. So, the aunt, the uncle, the grandparent in those situations. Something that just occurs to me, and I don't know the answer to this. If someone has their... So I'm going to ask you. So
Thanks.
Yeah, you're welcome. If someone has their PR stripped, can they reacquire it?
I cannot say that I've ever dealt with a case where that has happened or been successful or come across one. I'm not aware of anything that legally prevents, for example, if an order was made stripping PR, somebody then re-entering into a parental responsibility agreement or making an application back to court for a parental responsibility order. However, I think given that we've just said that to be stripped of your parental responsibility, something quite grave and serious must have happened, my view would be there would have to be quite a significant change between the two applications for the court to deem that would be in the child's welfare to reapply that parental responsibility. Yeah, I'm not aware of it ever happening. I can't see that it can't happen, but there would have to be like big changes.
Yeah, I think in those situations, it's if there's been sexual abuse or physical assault of a child, that seems almost impossible to imagine. I guess there must be circumstances where people are made special guardians and then that's discharged and then it could be made again, and that would be, your PR for special guardianship order purposes boomerangs back and comes in again.
Is it worth just chatting? We've talked about kind of the agreements and the things that the parties need to agree on if they've both got parental responsibility. But what if they can't agree? What would they do? So let's say little Johnny is just about to apply for secondary school next year. So school applications are open. We're recording this in October. And mum wants Johnny to go to one school and dad wants Johnny to go to the other school. They can't agree. How do they resolve that?
Okay, so here you're looking at a specific issue order is probably going to be the sort of legal framework for it, or it can be embodied in a wider child arrangements order. But effectively, you can make the application to court for the court to determine these discrete issues. And obviously, as we always say on this podcast, you don't have to go to court for these things. You should try mediation. You should try non-court dispute resolution. You might be able to sort things out, even if you've got, a family friend who can mediate these discussions. You want to try and do this. But if if there is a fundamental dispute about which school to go to, about medical treatment to consent to, about any kind of religious element, change of name, that's a big thing. Sometimes parties might want to double barrel a name, for example, to change the name of the child. Then you can make applications to the court to deal with that by way of a specific issue order. And what the court will do is look at the normal criteria that we've discussed before when it comes to Children Act applications. It's what's called the welfare checklist, which is set out in Section 1 of the Children Act. And that gives the court the criteria it needs to look at. And what is of paramount importance is the welfare of the child. So bluntly, the court doesn't really care about mum and doesn't care about dad in these applications, only cares about what is best for the child, and will make that assessment factoring in, any welfare needs, any special educational needs, any health needs, what the child's life looks like. There's often a sort of bias towards the status quo, I think, in Children Act proceedings, that change can often be not helpful to a child. So, what does their life look like? And then the child's wishes and feelings. And I think this can always be a tricky area when you get parents saying to you, well, my child wants to do X, Y, and Z, and the other parent might take a different view about what the child wants. So the court may consider the child's wishes and feelings, but it's got to be considered in light of their age and emotional maturity. So a 7-year-old is very different to a 13-year-old. And two 13-year-olds can be completely different from each other. Two 11-year-olds, that sort of cusp time of going to high school. There are some kids who are very mature and make very rational decisions about what they want, and their wishes and feelings are very, you look at them objectively and you think, well, these are fine. And some 11-year-olds are still kind of babies and don't understand the wider ramifications of what they want. So, these are all the factors that someone will look at. But as ever, the more you can sort things out yourself or with kind of third-party mediators and so on, and the less that you need to involve court, probably the better with those.
So that's it for this episode of Stowe Talks. Thanks for listening. If you would like more information on our podcast, head over to stowtalks.co.uk and please rate, like, share and review this podcast where you can.